A simple request turned into a nightmare of humiliation at 30,000 feet. What started as subtle rudeness soon spiraled into something far worse. What she didn't know was, someone powerful was watching everything unfold. Welcome to the channel. I'm thrilled to have you here as we explore captivating stories and insightful content together. If you enjoy what you see, I'd love for you to subscribe and join our growing community. Your support helps us continue creating meaningful content just for you. Rachel stood in the bustling airport, suitcase in hand, excitement bubbling inside her. She was headed to a conference she had been looking forward to for months, and it felt like the perfect opportunity to relax and recharge. As she made her way through security, she imagined herself sitting by the window, watching the clouds drift by as she read her favorite book. This was going to be a peaceful flight, or so she thought. Boarding time finally arrived, and Rachel joined the line of passengers waiting to enter the plane. As she approached the gate, she smiled warmly at the flight attendant checking boarding passes. "Good morning," Rachel said politely as she handed over her pass. Karen, the air hostess on duty, glanced up at her briefly, her eyes flicking over Rachel's appearance before she forced a thin, practiced smile. "Morning," Karen muttered, her tone lacking the warmth she had shown the passengers before Rachel. Rachel noticed the shift but didn't dwell on it, assuming Karen was just having a long day. Rachel walked down the aisle, maneuvering around the other passengers finding their seats. She reached her assigned seat near the middle of the plane and started to settle in, placing her bag in the overhead compartment and grabbing her book. She exhaled, happy to be aboard and looking forward to a smooth flight. Moments later, Karen appeared, strolling down the aisle with the usual bright smile she wore for other passengers. But when she got to Rachel's row, her demeanor changed. She barely glanced at Rachel before giving her a curt nod. Rachel, always one to give people the benefit of the doubt, smiled politely back. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Karen made her rounds, ensuring everyone had their seatbelts fastened. When she reached Rachel, she stopped, narrowed her eyes slightly, and said in an unnecessarily loud voice, "Make sure your seatbelt is fastened properly." Rachel looked down, surprised by the tone, and tugged the belt to show it was already secured. "It's fastened," she replied, her voice steady but confused. Karen stared for a moment before walking away without another word. Rachel felt a twinge of unease in her chest. Had she done something wrong? She looked around, noticing the other passengers getting more friendly smiles and kinder words from Karen as she continued down the aisle. Rachel shook her head slightly, trying to brush off the uncomfortable interaction. She opened her book and tried to focus, telling herself it was no big deal. The flight took off smoothly, and for a while, Rachel managed to relax. But her sense of peace was interrupted when Karen came around again with the drink cart. As she reached Rachel's row, her smile seemed to vanish again. Rachel requested a cup of water, but Karen handed it to her with an impatient look, as if she were an inconvenience. "Thanks," Rachel said softly, taking the cup. But before she could even lift it to her lips, Karen accidentally knocked the cup over, spilling water all over Rachel's lap. "Oh, I'm sorry," Karen said flatly, though there was no real apology in her tone. Her eyes didn't even meet Rachel's as she tossed a few napkins toward her before quickly moving on. Rachel sat there, stunned, as the cold water soaked into her clothes. She could feel the eyes of nearby passengers on her, some exchanging uncomfortable glances. Her hands trembled slightly as she dabbed at the water with the napkins, trying to clean up the mess. Karen didn't bother to check on her again, leaving Rachel feeling both humiliated and confused. Why was she being treated like this? What had she done to deserve such cold treatment? Rachel's excitement for the flight had quickly turned into dread, and a knot of anxiety settled in her stomach. She tried to convince herself it was just bad luck. Maybe Karen had spilled the drink by mistake. But deep down, Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just an accident. As the flight went on, Rachel braced herself for whatever might come next. The unease that had started at the boarding gate now settled firmly in her chest. She was determined to stay calm, but the tension in the air was growing. And Rachel couldn't help but wonder if things were about to get worse. Rachel sat in her seat, trying to dry off from the water Karen had spilled on her. The unease in her chest had grown into a tight knot, but she told herself to stay calm. Maybe it was just an accident. Maybe Karen wasn't doing this on purpose. She hoped it was nothing personal, but there was something about the way Karen looked at her that Rachel couldn't ignore. The plane had leveled off in the air, and the flight attendants began their service. Karen's bright, practiced smile returned as she moved down the aisle with the snack cart. She chatted with passengers, offering snacks and drinks, her demeanor warm and friendly, until she reached Rachel's row again. Rachel, still shaken from the earlier incident, decided to give Karen the benefit of the doubt. She politely asked for a small bag of pretzels, hoping this interaction would be better. "Can I have a bag of pretzels, please?" Rachel asked, her voice calm but guarded. Karen's eyes flicked to Rachel, her lips tightening slightly. "We're out," she said curtly without even looking at the cart. Rachel glanced at the cart, noticing the clear stack of pretzels right there. She hesitated, feeling the weight of the situation. "It looks like there's still some left," she began, but Karen cut her off. "I said we're out," Karen snapped, her voice louder this time. Some passengers turned their heads toward the commotion. Rachel could feel her cheeks flush as the eyes of the other passengers landed on her. She didn't want to argue or make a scene, so she simply nodded and muttered, "Okay, no problem." But the humiliation was starting to sting. Why was Karen treating her this way? Rachel had been nothing but polite. The tightness in her chest grew stronger. She tried to distract herself by reading her book, but the words blurred on the page as her mind raced. Minutes later, the cabin temperature seemed to drop, and Rachel started to feel cold. She noticed that other passengers had blankets, so she decided to request one. Maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. Rachel pressed the flight attendant call button, and soon Karen appeared, her face already wearing a look of impatience. "What is it?" Karen asked, her tone sharp. "Could I please have a blanket?" Rachel asked softly, trying to keep her voice steady. Karen rolled her eyes dramatically and crossed her arms. "A blanket? We don't just hand them out to everyone," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Rachel's heart sank. "I saw other passengers with blankets," she started, but before she could finish, Karen interrupted. "Those are for premium passengers," Karen said loudly, making sure the surrounding passengers could hear. "You're not entitled to special treatment. Maybe you should stop asking for things you don't deserve." Rachel felt the blood rush to her face. The entire row of passengers turned to stare, some whispering to each other. She could feel their eyes burning into her, and the humiliation hit her like a wave. Her heart pounded in her chest as she struggled to keep her emotions in check. Karen's words cut deep, making her feel small and unwelcome. The worst part wasn't even Karen's words. It was the silence from everyone else. No one stepped in. No one said a word. Rachel glanced around, seeing people avert their eyes, avoiding the awkwardness. Some looked sympathetic, but no one had the courage to speak up. Rachel's hands trembled as she gripped the armrests of her seat, trying to keep herself composed. She could feel the sting of tears welling up in her eyes, but she blinked them away. She wouldn't let Karen see her cry. She wouldn't give her that satisfaction. The rest of the flight passed in a blur for Rachel. She felt invisible, yet so painfully seen at the same time. Every moment dragged on, and she couldn't wait for it to be over. She was trapped in her seat, unable to escape the overwhelming feeling of humiliation that hung in the air like a dark cloud. Rachel didn't know what she had done to deserve this treatment. She had boarded the plane like any other passenger, paid for her ticket like everyone else, but Karen had singled her out. And for what? Rachel didn't want to believe it was because of the color of her skin, but the more she thought about it, the clearer it became. This wasn't just bad customer service. This was personal. The flight was far from over, but Rachel had reached her breaking point. Something had to change. She wouldn't stay silent anymore. Something inside her stirred, a quiet strength she hadn't felt before. It was time to stand up for herself. As the plane soared high above the clouds, Rachel's mind raced. The humiliation she had just endured sat heavy in her chest, but beneath that weight, something stronger was growing. A resolve. She had spent the entire flight trying to remain calm, to avoid making a scene. But no more. Enough was enough. Karen's harsh words echoed in Rachel's mind, but instead of letting them defeat her, they fueled her. She wasn't going to let this flight attendant treat her this way anymore. Rachel pressed the call button again. Her hand shook slightly as she did, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was from determination. Karen approached, her expression already one of annoyance. "What now?" she asked, her tone sharp and cold. Rachel stood up, steadying herself as she faced the air hostess. "I need to speak to you," Rachel said, her voice firm but calm. The other passengers turned their heads, sensing that something important was about to happen. Karen crossed her arms, raising an eyebrow. "Speak about what?" Rachel's heart pounded, but she stood tall. "About how you've treated me this entire flight. About how you've singled me out, embarrassed me, and treated me like I don't belong here." A murmur swept through the cabin as passengers turned to look at Karen, who now looked visibly uncomfortable. She scoffed, trying to maintain her composure. "I have no idea what you're talking about. I've treated you the same as everyone else." But the passengers weren't buying it. Some of them had witnessed the way Karen had treated Rachel, and they began to speak up. "I saw what you did to her earlier," one woman said from a few rows back. "You spilled water on her and didn't even apologize. I heard you deny her the blanket even though others had them." Another passenger added, "That was unnecessary." Karen's face turned pale as the murmurs grew louder. Rachel felt a surge of courage wash over her as she realized she wasn't alone. People were finally speaking up. But before Rachel could say another word, a man from the back of the plane stood up. He was well-dressed, wearing a tailored suit, and he had been quietly observing the entire flight. As he made his way to the front, the cabin fell silent. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice calm but authoritative. All eyes turned to him, and Karen's face drained of color. Rachel glanced at him, unsure of who he was, but something about the way he carried himself told her that this man had some authority. "I'm just trying to address the way I've been treated by this flight attendant," Rachel explained, her voice steady. "She's been rude, dismissive, and humiliating." The man nodded, turning to Karen. "Is this true?" Karen stammered, her confidence crumbling under the weight of the passenger's stares. I don't know what she's talking about. I've done nothing wrong." The man's expression didn't change. "I've been observing this flight very closely, Karen," he said calmly. "I saw the way you treated her. I saw everything." Karen's eyes widened in shock. Who are you?" she asked, her voice shaky. The man reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card. "I'm the CEO of this airline. I was flying undercover to evaluate the quality of our customer service." He held the card up for everyone to see. A gasp spread through the cabin. Karen's face turned bright red as she stood frozen, unable to speak. The passengers murmured in disbelief, some even shaking their heads. "I've seen enough." The CEO continued, "Your behavior toward this passenger has been completely unacceptable. Effective immediately, you are suspended from your duties. You will be formally investigated by the airline, and we will take appropriate disciplinary action." Karen's mouth opened as if she were about to protest, but no words came out. Her face crumpled with shame as she realized the gravity of the situation. Rachel stood there, stunned, her heart racing. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected to have an ally in the most powerful person on the plane. The CEO turned to Rachel, his expression softening. "I want to personally apologize for the way you were treated," he said. "What happened here is not a reflection of our airline's values, and we will do everything in our power to make sure it never happens again." Rachel blinked back tears. For the first time since boarding the plane, she felt heard. She felt seen. The passengers around her began to clap, some even standing up in support. Karen, now escorted to the back of the plane by another flight attendant, disappeared from sight. Rachel sank back into her seat, her heart still pounding. It wasn't the outcome she had expected, but it was the one she had needed. As the applause died down, Rachel took a deep breath. She had stood up for herself, and justice had been served. The plane finally began its descent, but Rachel's heart was still racing from the events that had unfolded just moments before. She couldn't believe it. Karen, the air hostess who had humiliated her throughout the flight, had been suspended right there in front of everyone. The CEO of the airline, who had been flying undercover, had witnessed everything and put a stop to it. It felt surreal, but there was no denying the justice that had just taken place. As the plane touched down on the runway, and the passengers began to gather their belongings, Rachel could feel the weight of the earlier humiliation beginning to lift. There was a sense of relief, but also a strange mix of emotions: exhaustion, pride, and even a lingering sadness. She had stood up for herself, but it hadn't been easy. The hurt from Karen's words and actions still stung. The passengers around Rachel were now talking openly about what had happened, and some even came up to her as they waited to disembark. A woman who had been sitting a few rows behind tapped her on the shoulder. "I'm so sorry for what you went through," the woman said softly. "You didn't deserve any of that. I wish I had spoken up sooner." Rachel smiled, though her voice was still a little shaky. "Thank you," she said. "I appreciate it. I couldn't stay silent anymore." Another passenger, a middle-aged man, chimed in. "You handled yourself with such grace," he said. "It took a lot of courage to speak up like that. I think we were all too shocked to say anything earlier, but I'm glad you didn't back down." Rachel nodded, grateful for the support, but the reality of what had happened still weighed on her. Karen had singled her out and treated her differently, and Rachel knew deep down that it wasn't just bad customer service. The hurtful looks, the snide remarks, there was a deeper prejudice at play. But in the end, it hadn't gone unnoticed, and that gave Rachel some comfort. As the line of passengers slowly shuffled forward to exit the plane, Rachel spotted the CEO waiting at the front near the exit door. He stood tall, his expression serious but kind as he greeted each passenger personally. When Rachel reached him, he extended his hand. "I want to apologize again for what you went through today," he said, his voice sincere. "This is not what we stand for as an airline, and I promise you that Karen's behavior will not go unpunished." Rachel took his hand, feeling a sense of closure as she shook it. "Thank you for stepping in," she said. "I didn't expect anyone to notice, let alone do anything about it." The CEO nodded, his eyes reflecting understanding. "It's important that we listen to our customers, and it's even more important that we act when we see injustice. Please know that we'll be in touch soon with a formal apology and compensation for your experience." Rachel appreciated the gesture, though she knew no amount of compensation could truly erase the hurt. Still, she felt lighter, knowing that there were people in power who were willing to stand up for what was right. As Rachel stepped off the plane and into the terminal, she felt a sense of freedom wash over her. The flight had been a nightmare, but it was finally over. She was ready to put it behind her. But before she could take another step, she felt a gentle tap on her shoulder. Turning around, she saw one of the flight attendants who had been working alongside Karen. The young woman looked nervous but determined. "I just wanted to say I'm really sorry for how Karen treated you," the flight attendant said quietly. "I should have done something. I saw how she was acting, but I didn't know how to handle it." Rachel was taken aback by the admission. She appreciated the honesty and could see that the woman was genuinely remorseful. "Thank you for saying that," Rachel replied, offering a small smile. "It's hard to speak up sometimes, but I'm glad you recognize it." The flight attendant nodded, relief washing over her face. "I promise I'll do better next time." Rachel gave her a reassuring nod before turning to leave the airport. As she walked through the busy terminal, she reflected on the day. It hadn't been easy, but standing up for herself had made all the difference. She hadn't let the humiliation break her, and that was something to be proud of. In the end, Karen had faced the consequences of her actions, and Rachel had found her voice. It wasn't just about a single flight. It was about standing up against injustice, no matter how small or big the situation. Rachel knew that there were others like her who faced similar struggles every day. And now, more than ever, she knew the power of speaking up. With her head held high and a newfound confidence, Rachel left the airport. It had been a turbulent journey, but she had landed stronger, knowing that karma had come full circle. Please consider subscribing to stay connected and never miss out on what's coming next. Your support means the world.